Good day and welcome to the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, the Great Recession Hits Home, Asset Depletion and Foreclosure in Boston webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Dr. Kristen Moore, Senior Scholar at Child Trends. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Welcome to our webinar on how the Great Recession hit home, a presentation by Dr. Hannah Thomas, who is our 8th Emerging Scholar for the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. And I also welcome Dr. Curtis Skinner from the National Center for Children in Poverty, who is our discussant today. Briefly, a quick overview of the SSRC, which is sponsored by the OPRE at HHS, the Planning, Research, and Evaluation. And the SSRC, Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, is, as shown on the next slide, a virtual library. It now has over 3,490 items on a dozen topics. These topics are shown on the right side of this slide. They range from asset building and tax policies, which is, of course, today's focus on asset building, to child care, to health, and TANF policy and transportation. So a wide array of topics as they relate to self-sufficiency. As you see on the left, the SSRC includes a number of features: customized search, the Browse Topics button, a section on our library recommends particular papers and research pieces, a summary of federal laws and regulations that are relevant. It also includes an events calendar and information on data sets and data sources that can be used for self-sufficiency research, and a gallery of partners shown here on the right side. To the SSRC's Emerging Scholar Initiative, we show here the selection criteria. They include being a graduate student or a degree recipient, no more than 10 years of experience, and currently doing research on a self-sufficiency issue related to the SSRC 12 topic areas, conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that warrants greater visibility. And they could be working in any of a variety of settings, an academic program, of course, but also a think tank or an agency setting. And we are open to receiving nominations for qualified candidates who are doing interesting work. So please do go to the website and nominate someone as an emerging scholar if you know someone. Today's speaker, Hannah Thomas, is a senior research associate at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. She has a PhD in social policy and sociology from Brandeis, and her research interests, as you might expect, are on the intersection of wealth, family, and community, and the accumulation, depletion, and uses of wealth. Her recent research is, of course, available on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. And our discussant is Curtis Skinner. He is a labor economist and director of the Family Economic Security Team at the National Center for Children in Poverty. He has a PhD in economics from Fordham University and is interested in the measurement of poverty at the state and locality level, and also state best practices for protecting the social safety net in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So first, Dr. Thomas will speak, and then Curtis will speak, and then we will offer you, throughout that time, the opportunity to submit questions and answers. You'll see this feature at the bottom right part of your screen. And after Dr. Skinner's comments, we'll have an opportunity for discussion and ask Dr. Thomas to answer these questions. And if there are questions that they are not able to answer, we will answer them after the webinar is formally over. But please do feel free to offer your questions throughout the discussion. Thank you very much, and now we'll hear from Dr. Hannah Thomas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore, and the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. I'm honored to have this opportunity to talk about my work. So today, as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about asset depletion and foreclosures in Boston. So So before I get going with the presentation, I do just want to acknowledge and thank some key organizations and individuals who were involved in making this research possible. I want to acknowledge the Rappaport Institute at the Kennedy School, who funded the initial research, as well as the Department of Neighborhood Development at the City of Boston, who hosted me as a fellow to do the research and helped with the recruitment of participants for the interviews. I also want to thank the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, both of whom funded different parts of the research. And I want to thank my advisor and mentor, Thomas Shapiro, who helped inform my thinking about the research project. I should say, though, that the mistakes are all mine, not anyone else's, who I've thanked here, and none of the findings can be attributed to any of those who funded or helped inform the research. So in this presentation, I'm going to spend some time exploring two key questions. The first one is what the negative consequences are for a family in foreclosure. What are the impacts of being in foreclosure on that family? And the second question is why families spend down their assets when they are in foreclosure. And within this, I'm particularly interested in why we see families getting themselves to the point where they're incredibly financially vulnerable. So to do this, I'm going to talk through what happens in foreclosures. We're going to look at what wealth and home ownership mean for families. We'll try and understand some of the context of the study, what happens during the process of asset depletion and exhaustion in the foreclosure, why families deplete their assets, and then finally we'll talk about some policy implications. But first, before we get to answer the questions I outlined, let's just take a step back and ask why we care about home ownership and wealth. There are certain specific benefits that household members gain from home ownership. The actual or threatened loss of the house through foreclosure highlights these benefits as family members realize what they are losing. The research literature has researched the benefits of home ownership and points to a variety of different benefits. They include greater civic participation. For example, neighborhoods that have higher home ownership rates tend to see higher voter turnout. Homeowners have also been seen to have improved health. The children of homeowners seem to have better educational performance, and families who own homes have greater financial predictability and stability from having fixed housing costs. We also know that home ownership provides a sizable portion of any single family's wealth, a fact that's particularly true for African American families and low and moderate income people that are building wealth. And then related to this presentation, I want to just highlight that homes provide a real sense of security and emotional satisfaction. The research has documented the ways that in the United States, as well as Great Britain, owning a home provides a sense of identity and security. Owning a home has a variety of different emotional attachments related to class status, security of tenure, and signifies being an owner. The American dream, for example, is strongly constructed as that owning one's home is a part of that American dream. Hence, we see large numbers of Americans aspiring to own a home. And so why do we care about how much wealth a family holds and why their wealth might be depleted as a result of foreclosure? We often think about income as the measure that we want to look at to understand a family's economic security and well-being. But income is like a river that provides economic security for only as long as it is flowing. Wealth, on the other hand, is like a pond. It's a store of financial resources that allows families to manage periods when the river of income dries up. For example, during a period of unemployment, or when a family has a health event for one of the major earners. So we can expect that if a family is in foreclosure, an economically challenging event, there may well be an impact on their wealth. How families respond to foreclosure, whether they use up their wealth stores, will impact their future well-being. Families with fewer assets more often experience material deprivation such as hunger or homelessness. Asset depletion through foreclosure may impact the resources that are available for children to attend college or to buy a home in the future. And it may impact the security of a household in later retirement years. And it will likely impact how a household weathers another economic challenge, such as a period of unemployment. Some families hold more wealth than others, and so the consequences of asset depletion may be greater for them than than standard families. The average African American family holds about $1 of wealth for every $1 of wealth that a white family holds. So the impacts of losing wealth through foreclosure could be seen as having more devastating effects on some groups who hold less wealth. And as we will see, families of color who tend to hold less wealth than white families on average see a disproportionate share of foreclosures. So let's look at the foreclosure crisis in the US now. Since 2007, between 2007 and 2012, 12.5 million homes went through the whole process of foreclosure. While the number of new foreclosures is finally slowing down, foreclosures do still continue. In 2013, foreclosure starts fluctuated around 1 million homes a month. And these are new foreclosures when I say foreclosure starts. And then in July of this year, there were fewer foreclosures than that, but it was still nearly 2/3 of a million homes that were in some stage of foreclosure. So while we think the foreclosure crisis is over, a large number of homes are still going into foreclosure, meaning that foreclosures are still impacting families. Those foreclosures are not evenly distributed. This map from July 2009, just as one example of a snapshot, gives a general sense of the counties in the US where there were more or fewer foreclosures. Where you can see the darker counties, those are where the hot spots are, and where they're lighter, there are fewer foreclosures. As you can see, the Rust Belt, the Southwest, and Florida were some of the main areas hit by foreclosures. Also hard hit was Massachusetts, where this study was conducted. Those foreclosures were not distributed evenly demographically either. This slide shows how communities of color have had a disproportionate share of foreclosures during the foreclosure crisis. Data in Boston, where the study that I will talk about took place, demonstrates the geographical clustering of foreclosures within neighborhoods that are historically lower income and communities of color. And this graph shows the distribution by race for nationally between Hispanic, Black, Asian, and white families. As you can see, Hispanic and Black families had many, many more foreclosures proportionately as a percentage of outstanding mortgages than did white families. So let's make sure everyone's on the same page about what happens in a foreclosure, because it can be a little complicated to understand. When a borrower is 3 months behind on making their mortgage payments, they get a notice of default. Then, when the borrower goes into default, there are a few different directions that things can go in. The borrower can cure the default themselves by paying all the money owed plus fees if they have that money available, and they choose to. They can request a loan modification, although this didn't exist as an option in 2007 and early 2008. A loan modification is when the borrower calls up the servicer and asks to reduce their mortgage payments for a number of months. This may include temporarily lowering the interest rate or tacking onto the balance of the mortgage any arrears and difference in payments so that that balance is paid at the end of the life of the loan. The homeowner can also sell their house for less than the value of the mortgage, and this is called a short sale. So the short sale requires that the homeowner they get an offer on the house for a sale, but it's less than the value of the mortgage. And they have to then go to the servicer and ask for the mortgage servicer's agreement to sell the house at this lower rate, since the mortgage servicer and the investors who have financed the mortgage servicer will have to take a loss on that mortgage, possibly. If the mortgage servicer agrees, then the borrower or the homeowner can go ahead and sell the property at this lower value. However, sometimes in the past, the servicer has refused to take that offer, and so the short sale doesn't go ahead. If that happens, or if any of the other options that I've just talked about don't happen, then the homeowner will probably go to foreclosure auction. And this is what you probably think of when you think of the foreclosure, when it either goes to court or someone stands in front of the house and says once, twice, 3 times sold. Some states have a judicial foreclosure auction, while others have a non-judicial foreclosure auction. In the states where there is a judicial foreclosure, the homeowner has the opportunity to go to court and challenge the foreclosure in front of a judge. And this can be helpful in cases where the foreclosure is being wrongfully applied. It does slow the entire process down, and so there's not really any good average for the length of time that it can take between the borrower going into default and then the house being sold at the foreclosure auction. Now, at any point during this process, the borrower or homeowner theoretically has the capacity to pay off any of the overdue amounts, or to pay off the full amount of the loan if they can find that money through a refinance or sell it to a member of the family. But in practice, these are much harder options to pursue. This short cartoon provides a little tongue-in-cheek look at the foreclosure process. And in this situation, the igloo owner is 3 months past due. The bank shows up with a blowtorch to melt the igloo while the owner is read their rights. So what do we know about the consequences that foreclosures can have on an individual household? As a result of a large number of cases that people have been able to study during the most recent foreclosure crisis, we have a bit more of an idea these days of the kinds of consequences that foreclosures can mean for a family. Studies have found negative health impacts from foreclosures on different household members, psychological impacts such as increased stress, and social impacts such as decreased civic engagement, as well as poorer performance in school. Let's dive into each of these in a bit more detail to look at what those impacts are. So health costs from the foreclosures have been documented in both the US and the UK. Being in foreclosure increased in some studies the proportion of family members' visits to the doctor. Families who were in foreclosure saw measurably higher rates of stress. Research has also linked increased residential mobility, which would result from a foreclosure, to an increased risk for behavioral and emotional problems in children. Other more recent research is pointing to a higher risk of foreclosure, families in foreclosure, for having major depression and suicide. And families are also at much higher risk of missing a prescription. There is also the risk of increased food deprivation for families. So these range of different health impacts really do have the possibility of reducing the health of different family members. There are also many different social costs for households who are in foreclosure. Children who need stable routines to thrive are impacted from having to move their homes and in some cases their school. There is evidence from analysis in New York City that children perform less well in school as a result of foreclosure, though other studies have had more mixed findings. Voter turnout is lower in neighborhoods where foreclosures have occurred, either as a spillover effect from that foreclosure or as a direct impact on the individual's buy-in to the political system. Research has also demonstrated that individuals who have gone through foreclosure demonstrate less trust in banks after having gone through foreclosure, a critical piece as we think about some of the financial impacts that there may be. And to turn to those financial consequences, research has documented a massive decrease in wealth as a result of foreclosures, estimated at somewhere around $7 trillion nationally by 2012. Families also have documented lower credit scores and increased bankruptcy rates. These consequences hit households of color harder, both because they are disproportionately represented among families in foreclosures as compared with white families, and because households of color tend to hold less wealth in home equity than white families. So let's jump into the study in Boston, where I'm going to talk more about the impact of foreclosures particularly on wealth. But before I get into the findings, I do want to just highlight the context of the study, who I talked to, what I did, and where it took place. The study draws from 37 in-depth interviews that were conducted in 2007 and 2008 in Boston that was right at the start of the foreclosure crisis. Those interviews, as I'll show in the next slide, were predominantly with Black Caribbean immigrants, African Americans, or Latino families. I partnered with the City of Boston and the Department of Housing and Urban Development to recruit families into the study. Families interviewed were drawn from around the City of Boston and represented the geographical distribution of foreclosures in the city at that time period. Interviews typically lasted about 1 to 2 hours. The interviewee got to choose where they did the interview to give them the most control, since most elements of their life were out of control at that particular moment. Information covered in the interview included the story of the foreclosure, the precipitating events for the foreclosure, and financial information about the household. Here's a quick look at what the sample looked like. 3/4 of the sample was African American or a black immigrant. Nearly half the sample were immigrants of some kind, whether they were black immigrants or Hispanic immigrants or white immigrants. The mean age was 50 years, and about half of the sample that I interviewed were married. 1/3 of the sample had completed college, and another third had got beyond high school but hadn't gone to college. There were renters present in just over half of the interview sample, a reflection of the large number of multifamily properties in Boston. And you'll see in a couple of slides' time that multifamily situation does have an impact on some of the reasons that we see why families were going into foreclosure. Okay, so let's turn to examining what happens when families face foreclosure. What is the impact on their household assets? We'll turn to the story of Ralph, who was completely emptied out, as he put it, as a result of going through foreclosure. Ralph, an older African-American man who worked in the home building business, wanted a house for his disabled wife. He hoped to live with her in their retirement in a secure place that had manageable costs. As he said, "In this point in our life, we needed to have something that we owned so we could, as I said, try to have a steady cost we could fix within my fixed income." He and his wife bought a home, but they got an adjustable rate mortgage, and then when the Great Recession reduced the income from his business, he found himself emptying his savings in stages to pay for the mortgage. Then the increase in the mortgage monthly payments after the interest rate increased, which is what happens in adjustable rate mortgages. At some point, the mortgage payments increase. These increases meant that he used more of his savings to pay for the mortgage. He said, "Well, it didn't completely empty it out, but it got it down pretty low, and then when the escalations came on, that completely emptied it out, which was this year, well, not this year, last year, 2007. That's when it got completely emptied out. And now I'm on deficit spending." He reminisced about the good times when he could save for retirement. He said, "It's gone now. It's just a memory from when the housing boom was going high and I had more work than I could handle, and I was able to put something away." So Ralph found that the lower income from his business and the slow economy and the cost of putting his kids through college, coupled with an increase in his mortgage payments, had eaten away at all of his savings, leaving him in a precarious financial situation for retirement. Ralph indeed ended up losing his home in foreclosure, a case of total asset exhaustion. Ralph's situation was a common one in the interviews. This table shows the first 10 interviewees that have the information here about what the events were that led to a decrease in income or an increase in expenses. It also talks about the assets that were exhausted and any loans taken out. So to give you a sense of just summarizing this table, most of the families that were interviewed in this study were employed. The event that caused them to have an unsustainable budget included a variety of different reasons, from an unaffordable mortgage, the loss of rental income, which is related to this number of multifamily properties in Boston. Unemployment was important, and divorce, as well as one case of a husband gambling. As you can see in the table, families used their assets from their savings, from their retirement accounts. They took out loans from friends, and they used credit cards, all to try to make ends meet and pay their mortgage. Facing unbalanced budgets from an income reduction at work, unemployment, or the mortgage payment that was always unaffordable, they spent down their household assets, as I said. Some even took on debt. Others drew on their extended family members to ask for help. Sometimes this plan worked. Using some of their stored wealth, families restored their household budgets, either stabilizing their finances and preventing further use of the assets in that moment, or even allowing for rebuilding savings. However, as occurred in the case of many of the families in foreclosure that I interviewed, sometimes they continued to deplete their assets until they had none left. Such families were left in a state of complete asset exhaustion. It's important to make the distinction here between asset depletion and total asset exhaustion. When families deplete their assets, they still have some financial resources to bring to bear on family well-being, both in the present and the future. On the contrary, when families have exhausted their assets, they become particularly vulnerable to future financial instability and economic shocks. They are no longer able to invest in their children or themselves unless they can rebuild their asset store. It's more likely that such families end up needing help from their extended family and community networks and government resources. In families interviewed in Boston that were in foreclosure, depleting assets to the point of asset exhaustion occurred because of the interaction between an unsustainable budget situation and a strong motivation to remain a homeowner. Families reported that they took money out of savings or retirement funds in stages, and sometimes they were able to get back on their feet for a while only to get into financial trouble again. Thus, asset depletion unfolds as a process until the point of asset exhaustion. We have to ask why families chose to forfeit future well-being for staying in their home. Surely if they looked at their budget and saw that they weren't making enough money to support their mortgage, why didn't they sell their homes, especially in 2007 when the housing market had not yet crashed? The answer is in the strong meanings that were attached to the homes that they lived in and the challenges presented in the alternative rental market. I will now turn to some stories to illustrate the ways that meanings motivated spending down assets or taking on debt to prevent losing the home. So one key motivation that I saw in the interviews for trying to hold on to one's home was particularly important for immigrants interviewed. It was being part of the American dream. Solomon spoke about why he wanted to own a home. He said, why I wanted to buy a house? Because it's always the American dream. One wants to buy one's own house to live well and to be paying for oneself. Owning one's own home is a deeply held value in the United States. It provides, therefore, a particularly strong motivation for families to keep their homes even when doing so threatens their current financial viability and their financial future. Many of the families were like Solomon, an immigrant family for whom owning a home was a particularly important reality, and helps explain why they spent down some of that or all of their assets in order to keep their home. Families also talked about the importance of safety and control. Katerina, an immigrant, bought a condo in Boston, but found that the mortgage payments were too much to keep up with. She had taken on credit card debt to keep paying the mortgage. At the time of the interview, she was in foreclosure, trying to get help from a counseling agency. She summed up the importance of safety for her children and why she did not want to rent again when she described the low quality of rental options she'd experienced before buying her condo. When she was renting, she had found her next-door neighbor was coming into her apartment without her permission. She wanted to make sure that she had a safe place for her children. As she explained, I found this person was going to my porch, opening the doors, doing whatever he wants in my apartment, so I feel like it's dangerous because at nights those apartments don't have a key on every room. When my other two kids come to this country, I'd better have something safe for them because it wasn't safe. Nothing happened to me, but it was like, door open, cigarettes, things in my apartment, and sometimes there was marijuana next door, so it's better me living here. So that's why I was looking to buy an apartment. Having a place to raise children was also an important motivation. Yolanda, an African-American mother, saw homeownership as a way to ensure she had a place where children could run and play, where she could raise her children without a headache. The more general prospect of losing a home and the impact that this might have on children provided a key motivation for Jana as she considered whether or not to spend down her assets to save her home. She said, "You know what is sad? If you don't have any kids, I mean, you don't care. You just go pay rent somewhere else or do something. But when you have kids, you look at them, at your situation. You don't think about you. You think about them. What is going to happen to them if they call home and there is no home anymore? And when they're too young to understand these kind of things, so you have to try to and tell them, well, it's not our house anymore. We have to move. We can start again. But kids get used to things like anybody does." For other families, the home had symbolic meaning. There were family memories and history, and losing the home would have meant losing those memories. Donna described the family significance of her home, important to her as she again considered whether or not to keep trying to pay the mortgage and take on debt or use her assets. She said, "I inherited it from my grandmother, about 20 years, maybe more. I took care of my grandmother, lived there. It's a family house." These sets of meanings that families associated with their homes meant that they were willing to work hard and spend any saved wealth they had to try and keep their home, even if it meant trading off their future well-being to do so. So what are the implications of this research? Well, there are many families that are still going through foreclosure today. And so the research continues to be relevant to our understanding of how households are coping and managing financially. As policymakers, we need to look at ways to help rebuild family economic security and to think about the way we design programs to make sure that families in foreclosure understand very explicitly the financial trade-offs that they're making by trying to stay in the home. We also have to do preventative strategies to make sure that families have assets to start with. Building family resilience means building a base of assets that families can draw on in times of emergency and that they can use for future financial well-being. There are a range of programs that help to build assets for families, such as matched retirement accounts at work and individual development accounts, which are often offered through community development organizations. There is a proposal currently amongst some federal legislators to create a financial security tax credit, which would make a matched savings account for low-income families that could be created at tax time, around the same time folks are getting their earned income tax credits back. That financial security tax credit does seem to have some play, and so that's one to watch that could be a good policy for building family assets. Other research that I've been involved in points to the important role that sufficient income plays in building assets. Not only is sufficient income important, but jobs with characteristics such as benefits and flexible work schedules. Families need decent paying jobs with matched retirement savings opportunities, health insurance, investment in human capital, and job flexibility if they are to build wealth. And I may get asked questions about this, but other research that I've done in the Leveraging Mobility study really points to the role that the type of job that a family has can play in building family wealth. And for families to maintain a decent asset profile, they need protection of those assets so that during financial potholes like unemployment, they don't exhaust their assets, as we've seen in this study. Many of the families that face foreclosure face life events that happen to families on a regular basis, but they challenge those families' capacity to cope financially. And we need to look at and think about ways that we can help families during financial potholes to emerge more resilient. A key part of the policy implications of this research is also ensuring that families don't get into unsustainable homeownership situations. Unsustainable homeownership can come from buying too much home, but often it occurs because of inappropriate mortgage lending practices. Programs such as Self-Help's Community Advantage Program offer mortgages with appropriate terms, supporting borrowers through life events such as unemployment, enabling for families to succeed in homeownership. The motivation is there from the families to succeed in homeownership, but we need to make sure that the support structures to create sustainable homeownership are also there to meet those families. And we need to ensure that there are appropriately priced properties, particularly in strong housing markets such as Boston. Moderate and low-income homeowners face high home prices that make it hard to get into homeownership without stretching oneself financially. Affordable homes are needed in such markets so that an affordable and safe alternative to renting exists. And so this takes me to another piece of this preventing unsustainable home ownership. We need to look at the rental market, which is the alternative to home ownership, and we need to clean it up. Basic protections and standards need to be in place and enforced. The pressure from unsatisfactory rental housing stock pushes families into home ownership when that may not be the best option for them. And as we saw in the case of Jana, that was, Katerina, that was pushing her towards home ownership when she may have done better to stay in a rental situation. We also need to protect assets in the foreclosure process, and so the next two slides are going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of foreclosures rather than the more general context surrounding them. We need to protect those assets and find ways to ensure that families take into full account the consequences of decisions that they make during the foreclosure process to spend down their assets or take on debt. Policymakers might consider 3 steps that increase the awareness of the family decision makers as they make those decisions. The first one could be to help families make informed decisions. Policymakers could establish withdrawals as a trigger for counseling about other possible options. So as a family is about to take money out of their retirement fund, they're triggered to have a conversation with some credit counselor or a retirement counselor to think about what other options may be available to them, such as loans against their retirement account or other financial help available in their local area. Coupled with such financial counseling, we need to think about an asset vulnerability assessment tool. Other ways that we can help families understand different scenarios that they could see themselves in as a result of different decisions that they made when they were in a financially difficult position. For example, what would be the decision of allowing the house to go through foreclosure versus cashing out their 401k or savings? Thirdly, we need to think about a mortgage grace payment period from the mortgage services. There are pieces, everybody is going to have events such as illness and unemployment, and programs such as the Community Advantage program that I mentioned earlier offer ways for families to come to some arrangement in working through those difficult periods of life and continuing to keep their mortgage current. The loan modification program is a variation on this, but it's currently not required as standard practice across the industry and people are often rejected from getting loan modifications. If there was a way that that could be expanded for more families, I think that there could be a strong impact on preventing families from getting into the foreclosure situation and facing losing their house. And finally, for this slide, given the meanings and attachments of homes for many families, housing and foreclosure counselors need to be trained in how to provide meaningful counseling about the emotional burden of the foreclosure, or to have a list of referrals that they can make to therapists and other social service workers. The process of potentially losing a house creates an important set of emotional and psychological losses that a family has to face. And in order to face them, they need help. Our housing counseling and foreclosure counseling system is not well set up for this currently. And I think that it's critical for us to look at this emotional piece of the potential loss so that families can make better financial decisions while they informed from what their emotional, not just from their emotions, but also from reason for their long-term well-being. Finally, we need to look at ways to rebuild household asset profiles. If the families profiled here are anything to go by, the survivors of the first wave of foreclosures between 2006 and 2008 are very likely financially vulnerable exiting foreclosure as homeowners or now as renters. These are families that federal programs have largely ignored because they were so early in the foreclosure crisis. Advice for families post-foreclosure has mostly focused on rebuilding credit, which is a critical and long-term step to regaining financial stability. Policymakers have a role in helping with that rebuilding and talking to lenders and insurance agents and even credit scoring agencies to remove or reduce the impact of foreclosure on credit scores. But we also need to look at how we rebuild assets of families that have exhausted, in many cases, much of their personal wealth. A federal program that attempted to assist rebuilding assets of the families in foreclosure would help reduce future reforeclosures and would ultimately assist in stabilizing the housing market, as well as establishing future stability and well-being for those families, not to speak of that set of families that will be entering retirement soon. Understanding the implications of family assets of trying to stave off foreclosures is a critical component of building effective policy to prevent more foreclosures. This understanding is also necessary to remedy the consequences of foreclosure for families that are already in it or that have survived it. These findings lay a foundation for that understanding, and they also provide a window into the wealth implications of homeownership, raising critical questions about the structures surrounding homeownership. If adverse life events that negatively affect income, such as unemployment, health shocks, and loss of rental income, can be expected to occur on a regular basis, then we also can expect that more families will exhaust their assets. It is this likelihood, then, that the current system of mortgage finance and servicing needs to better take into account if we are to expect homeownership to offer wealth-building opportunities for everyone, rather than wealth-depleting experiences for some section of society. Thank you so much for listening to this research, and I will turn it over now to Dr. Skinner. Or back to Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Hannah Thomas. And we will now go from Boston down to New York, where Dr. Curtis Skinner will provide some brief remarks as a discussant. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to be a discussant on this session. Dr. Thomas, I thought your research is very interesting and very important work, and it also shows the importance of primary data gathering and qualitative research, because I think this is really an oft-overlooked problem. People know about foreclosure, but they don't really know about this issue of asset depletion to try to prevent foreclosure and hang on to the house. So I think this is really important to draw attention to. As you mentioned, it does seem to be a very difficult problem because it's got both emotional and financial investment in home ownership here in the U.S. So the mortgage is paying not only, for shelter, but it's paying for increments of an asset. And as you mentioned, owning a home is linked to a lot of positive experience here in the U.S., and it's part of the American dream. So I think it makes it extremely difficult for people to walk away from an investment in a home, even though they should know better, one would think. It's also, I think, really hard to know how long to draw down your assets, which can be rational, if you think the reduction in your income is due to a shock and is likely to be temporary. It's just really hard to know how long you should do this. I was really intrigued that a large share of your sample are employed, and I thought all of your policy recommendations were quite good, but I wondered too, thinking about that, whether there might be an expanded role for employers in financial counseling to their workers. Also, I wondered a bit about other possibilities maybe for interventions, thinking about credit unions, community savings pools, low-cost credit to cover temporary reductions in income, and whether communities and community-based organizations can maybe think about pools of funds. It's probably, way too big a problem for them to do a whole lot, but there may be something they can do, and certainly low-cost government loans. I was interested in, I think it's such an interesting project that I was interested too in whether you or others are planning to do similar research in other low-income areas with high rates of foreclosure, because I think it'd really be interesting to know how widespread the problem is. And it looks like there's there are a number of data sources out there from the Federal Reserve Bank and from HUD that identify neighborhoods with high rates of delinquencies and high rates of subprime lending, and would allow policymakers and others, I think, to monitor neighborhoods at risk, and then hopefully, conceivably, both nonprofit organizations and local governments could maybe intervene with counseling services and with targeted information for these neighborhoods. That's, again, thanks so much for this work. I found it really interesting, and suppose we can turn it over to questions from the audience now.
Great, thank you so much. And please, audience members, feel free to ask questions by writing them in the Q&A section at the lower right-hand section of your screen. One question is, noting that half of the respondents had renters. Couldn't renters have helped solve this problem?
That is a really interesting question, and actually, yes, there's been a line of thinking in Boston. There have been groups working from a group called City Life and also the Boston Tenants Coalition, who have been working to see if they can have tenants cooperatively buy the property that's in foreclosure from the owner. So that has been looked at as one possible avenue. I think that there are other ways that renters or tenants could be seen as ways of helping in solving a potential problem in foreclosure. But I think what would happen in the interviews was that at least in the cases where tenants weren't providing income for a period of time, it was the financial stress that the tenant themselves was experiencing, which meant that they often weren't paying for the rent. Now, the other portion of sort of closed off income that the families who were in foreclosure had often rented to Section 8 renters, and they would find that what's now called Housing Choice Voucher Program, that Section 8 wasn't actually providing the certification that they needed in order to get their rental income coming in. So they had a sort of that catch-22 where they needed to invest some money to improve, usually not a huge thing in their apartment. It might be replacing a laundry unit or mending sort of a window, and but that cost was sufficiently large that they maybe had spent some money on doing that, but then there was a lag period between the time when they then got the certification and the money started flowing back into them. So there were a number of families that were struggling with Section 8 rental income. But I do think it's an interesting question to think about the policy in ways that the renters themselves could be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. And this question builds, thank you, it's really fascinating and very poignant, some of their stories. Speaking for myself, a question about whether this is still happening and whether this builds on Curtis Skinner's question. Are there any national data on how common this is?
No, well, yeah, the data nationally on foreclosure is a bit challenging. I mean, there have been many studies like mine that have gone into different communities around the country and done interviews with families who are in foreclosure, but there hasn't really been a standard interview protocol. And so one of the questions that I think, well, one of the sort of pieces that I think would be a really fascinating next step would be to bring together all of the researchers that have done interview studies like this, compare interview protocols, what the questions asked, what are the common data points. And I mean, from my perspective, I'd be very interested in the common financial data points. And then really try to see what we could learn from, I think, what would be quite a number of different, quite a large sample at that point from around the country. Right. There are national data sets available on foreclosures, but it's really on the loan rather than the borrower. And so the information in it doesn't give you a great deal of sort of household level financial detail that would be really critical to answering answering the question of how extensive is this problem. And that I've sort of looked at some national surveys like the Panel Survey on Income Dynamics, where they started asking questions about foreclosure, but there's just simply not a large enough sample because, I mean, we're still talking in the below 5% of the entire US population, even though the numbers are large, in millions, the actual percentage-wise of the US population is quite small. And so when you get to a national survey like the Panel Study on Income Dynamics, there's simply not a large enough sample to really get anything useful from it.
Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Skinner.
Dr. Thomas, I wondered, do you know of any local groups, nonprofit groups, and community-based groups that are cognizant of this problem and are working with people to kind of manage their assets and make decisions such that they don't exhaust important retirement vehicles and so on?
I actually don't know of any group who specifically, I should say, I think most foreclosure counselors are thinking about about these questions, but they're in a very sort of more crisis-oriented moment and underfunded organizations. So I think it's, there's that sort of piece. I want to just acknowledge the work that the foreclosure counselors are doing because they're working very hard in the field. But at the same time, I don't actually know of any group that has been really looking at the asset profiles in depth of those families and sort of going through a more in-depth, longer-term process. And I think that's possibly one of the tensions in what I'm proposing, right, in terms of my policy recommendations, is that we do a more intensive process with families, and the funding hasn't been there to date to be able to do that, I suspect, as part of the challenge. And the tension between trying to put out the fire and sort of really respond to the immediate desire that family has to save their home versus helping that family slow down while the clock is always ticking towards the possible loss of the home. So I think that there are a number of things that sort of make it harder to do that. And one of the nice things that we might sort of ask of the mortgage services in some ways is that if the process is slowed down, families could really begin to get to grips with what their financial situation is and what the better outcome might be. Now, so I say all of that. The Community Advantage Program at Self-Help does seem to have, and I've sort of looked at them from afar and would love to do a study of them. But I think that they have mortgage servicer practices, from what I understand, that integrate more of this financial counseling model, more of this working with the homeowner in more depth to accommodate their financial reality. So it's a different model than the current model of mortgage servicing coupled with foreclosure counseling.
Right. And what's the name of this group, Dr. Thomas, again?
The Self-Help Credit Union. They're based in North Carolina, and they got they have a relatively large secondary market program called the Community Action Program, or CAP. It was funded by the Ford Foundation, and it was to demonstrate the viability of low-income home ownership, and basically they were set out to demonstrate that low-income borrowers could really borrow and maintain their mortgage without becoming delinquent. And through the foreclosure crisis, they had very low, comparatively with other similar populations, very low foreclosure rates. So it's been a really great model, I think.
So interesting. Here's a question that just came in. It's lengthy, but a good question. Aren't some of the consequences of foreclosure intention? So asset exhaustion is a consequence of foreclosure as folks deplete assets to avoid the foreclosure. Increased mobility lowers voter turnout. That's also a consequence of foreclosure. So if I'm counseling someone, which consequence is worse? I can encourage preventing mobility and community impacts by leveraging assets to prevent the foreclosure, but that just gets the borrower closer to asset exhaustion. Does the research indicate which side to err on?
Well, this is a really good question because, it's getting at the challenges of the neighborhood consequences versus the individual household consequences. And sometimes those two consequences, as the person who's writing that question is indicating, are in tension with one another. And I think this is where sort of community organizations that are working on this problem, I think sort of the goal of foreclosure counseling, as I understand it, is to sort of to figure out what the best situation is for that individual family. And then we have programs trying to work with the consequences for the neighborhood of that foreclosure. And some other research that I have done has looked at specifically the community impacts from the foreclosure. And while there is the mobility piece is obviously a challenge, but I think part of the challenge with the mobility, where the research gets into the consequences from that mobility, is when that mobility is from a forced decision. So if someone who's in foreclosure feels that they're sort of right up to the end, they are not wanting to leave their house, and even despite everything they're doing, despite spending down their assets, they are still having to lose their house in foreclosure. That's still going to feel like a forced decision, right? Even though they're continuing to fight it. If that family makes a decision earlier in the process and says, well, if I look at my overall financial picture, I might be in a much better situation if I if I choose and I come to terms with losing this house and I choose to move, the consequences of mobility may actually be less. And so part of the research on mobility and moving hasn't necessarily teased out really well that question of, is it a forced decision to move, or is it an actual by choice decision? Now, I think in an ideal world the family would never have to move, but I think it is a nuance, and we need to be mindful of that nuance when in the counseling process.
Okay, I have one last question. We have just a minute, but it is, you discussed race disparities in foreclosures and asset depletion. Foreclosures seem to be an issue that can affect middle-class workers. Are there differences in the effects of foreclosure and the likelihood of families to deplete their assets by family income?
This is a really good question, and I think we just can't answer that question as well as we'd like. We can see by geography, and I showed that slide of the breakdown by racial disparity. That was based on a geographical, that was based on a borrower analysis by race. So that data set, this is where we get into some of the challenges with the data. The data that graph was, or that chart was shown from, is data that has since been pulled away from analysis by the company that provided the data because of concerns that it would negatively impact the mortgage servicing industry.
Really interesting.
So
we only have a couple of seconds left, by the way.
Oh yeah, okay. So hence we're not actually able to see, we could have done the analysis on income because that data was included in that, but we can't. That data is now being taken away.
Okay, well, because people at various income levels might buy homes that stretch their incomes at every level.
Right,
this was a fascinating discussion. I want to thank you both, Hannah Thomas and Curtis Skinner, for providing such an interesting discussion. And thanks to all of you who joined us. Bye.
This does conclude today's conference. Thank you for your participation.